McQuestion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuestion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Marijuana is being legalized in many states, though the federal government still considers it a Schedule I drug. Some of our friends think that legalization is a good idea. Some of our friends say marijuana is dangerous and should be tightly controlled. On this program, you're going to hear from those who are leading the way to legalization and from those who see the downside on using this substance. But before we meet our experts, I'm honored to introduce my co-host. Katie Carroll Witten is an award-winning print, radio, and television journalist who had her own television program in Colorado, and that's particularly interesting, Stephen. We're talking about marijuana here, so welcome to the program,
Thank
Katie.
you so much. Very apropos. I didn't plan it that way.
I got it.
Now I'd like to get started by introducing one of our guests. We have here David Vanderveeren. David is a licensed professional counselor and the founder of Sea Change. He's also, and Sea Change is here in Carrollton, Texas.
Carrollton, Texas, yes.
Okay, very good. And you have a master's degree in professional counseling
Yes.
and a bachelor's degree in both psychology and Christian ministries from Dallas Baptist University.
Yes.
And most importantly, David is an addiction survivor of 24 years. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here, David. And joining us
Good to be here.
Joining us via Skype is Mason Tvert. He's Media Relations Director for the Marijuana Policy Project and has worked on several state advocacy campaigns, including the successful 2012 initiative campaign to regulate marijuana like alcohol in Colorado. Mason is the co-author of the book, Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? And he's been called Colorado's top thinker in politics and government by the Denver Post. So, Mason, welcome to the program. So tell our viewers what the Marijuana Policy Project is, and then give us what you think the benefits are of the legalization process so far.
Sure, thank you for having me. The Marijuana Policy Project is the nation's largest organization dedicated to reforming our nation's marijuana laws and replacing our failed prohibition policies with more sensible ones that regulate marijuana and treat it more like alcohol and ensure that it's available for those who could benefit from it for medical purposes. MPP has been largely responsible for a lot of the state marijuana laws that have passed around the country over the last couple decades. And ultimately, prohibition has failed. And our goal is to have more sensible laws that are laws that people will respect. The majority of Americans think marijuana should be legal, about 66% now. And, you're seeing marijuana entirely uncontrolled. It is being sold illegally on the streets. And what we want to do is tightly control it. We want to make sure that it's being sold by licensed producers and retailers, and that it's being taxed, and that we know who they're selling to, so that we can ensure people are staying safe and that we're keeping it out of the hands of kids.
Okay, thank you, Mason. We'll be back to you shortly. Katie?
David, you just heard Mason talk about marijuana and being pro for the legalization, but you have a very personal story. If you're willing to share it with us, I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. Right before I do that, I would like to just kind of comment on one of the things that Mason said. It's a common myth that marijuana is safer than alcohol. They're basing that result on acute toxicity mortality rates. Okay, we don't know the long-term effects of is marijuana going to be safer than alcohol. Those studies haven't been done. So that information is relevant, I think, to know, for everyone to know.
Do we even know if it's addictive?
Oh, yes. 1 in 10 people will become addicted to marijuana, and disturbingly, that number goes up to 6 in 10 when they start using before the age of 18.
Wow. So tell us about your story.
Yes. So I started using at 12 years old, and the first thing I did try was marijuana, and came from a broken home and had some other situations, but I ended up finding substances, if you would. And I suffer from the disease of addiction. And it's important for people to understand there's a difference between addiction and dependence. Addiction, the chronic progressive brain condition, if you would, and dependence, meaning someone might go through a situation in their life where they're using a substance very heavily, but then they're able to let that go and move on with life.
Is addiction something they can scan in your brain, actually see? I know they've identified an addiction or an alcoholism gene.
Right, right. Well, that's actually a myth. There's not an alcoholism gene as opposed to a marijuana gene, so on and so forth. It's the gene, if you would, of addiction. And there's two chemicals. With the advent of MRIs and PET scans, we understand now that there's two chemicals working differently, dopamine and glutamate. And the most basic example I can give you of that is in the non-addicted brain, someone who has a glass of alcohol will relax. They socialize, they wind down. The addicted brain has a glass of alcohol and it energizes, it goes in a different direction. So we can see that happening. So we have chemical things happening differently in the brain of someone who does suffer from addiction.
Okay.
All right, Mason, I want to clarify one thing with you. Mason, would it be fair to say that you guys are not advocating that underage youth prevent, I should say, try to prevent them, you're trying to prevent them from using marijuana. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. I mean, let's be clear here. Both sides of this argument, we want to prevent young people from getting access to marijuana. But what we're seeing is that for the last several decades, the vast majority of young people have said it's easy to get marijuana, despite it being illegal. So we're really, as a country, arresting and punishing hundreds of thousands of adults to keep it out of the hands of teens, and teens say they can get it more easily than adults. What we want to do is control it and make sure that it's difficult for teens to access and that they have to show ID like they would with alcohol.
All right, good. I appreciate that. Now, just to be clear, that's where he's coming from too. However, you said you started at 12, wow. And what is the impact, medically, the impact on a young brain of 12 or even 16 or 18 or obviously younger than 12? What is that impact?
Well, we know that specifically marijuana hijacks the process in the hippocampus, okay, and that handles reasoning, emotions, so on and so forth. When someone begins to use a drug at a time when the brain is busy formulating, if you would, trying to figure out the structure of operating, and we introduce a chemical, that can have long-term effects in the brain. So this is where much of the research right now is focused on. In most of the studies now, we see that people who use marijuana, say after the age of 25, aren't experiencing some of these short and long-term effects, if you would.
I want to get back to more about the health risks, but I wanted to hear a little bit more of your story. How did you get clean and sober? It's been almost 25 years.
It was a long journey, and so my journey through addiction delayed my attainment of education. I mean, it stalled my life, if you would, until I got that part of it under control. And I had trouble with mood regulation and all of the things that we see now in the research. I was, if you would, a living kind of longitudinal study of what marijuana will do over the course of a lifetime when someone starts at a young age. So at 30 years old, I came to a crossroads in my life where it's like the pictures were flashing before my eyes. I could go in the same direction, or I could make a decision and try and do something differently. And my journey started in the rooms of AA, and my faith ended up being a primary part of what happened to me in the end. And I came and eventually, I mean, I think about my potential sometimes. I went back in my 40s and did my bachelor's and did my master's, but I struggled. I struggled with the things we see in the effects of marijuana. I struggled in the area of retaining information, long-term memory, so on and so forth, the cognitive aspects of it. I was someone who had to really kind of focus to keep information in my mind before testing and so on and so forth. So I literally watched this happen as I was learning about the research and how, again, drugs, alcohol, those things affect the brain.
But you finally got sober.
I made it.
You made it.
I made it.
So Mason, there are millions of addicts like David, but unfortunately many of them do not get clean and sober. Have the opponents' fears come true? People who oppose the legalization of marijuana, have they come true?
No, what we're really seeing is that the laws here in Colorado and some of the other states that have passed them are working quite well. And we've even seen elected officials who were initially opposed to these laws coming around and acknowledging that the sky didn't fall, and they're actually really working out. I mean, you've not seen any sort of increase in teen use here in Colorado or any of the states that have made marijuana legal for adults. We've not really seen any sort of significant new problems. Basically, marijuana is something that's been widely available for years. Anyone who wanted it could get their hands on it. It's just that now we're actually controlling it, and millions of dollars in sales are taking place in licensed businesses instead of out on the street.